Позвольте предоставить слово нашему коллеге из ПРООН Колумбии, господину Маурисио Руиз. Он является координатором совместной программы ООН в офисе ПРООН Колумбии. У Маурисио экономическое образование, и до работы в ПРООН он работал в качестве консультанта в ряде международных организаций, включая МВФ, Межамериканский банк развития, АБР, а также работал советником посольства Колумбии в посольствах США в Индонезии, то есть работал советником правительства Колумбии, а также в посольствах США в Индонезии и Гватемале. Презентация Маурисио посвящена колумбийскому опыту методологии согласования ЦУР и маркировки бюджета с ЦУР. Маурисио, он, несмотря на то, что в Колумбии сейчас очень рано, поэтому Маурисио любезно согласился сделать эту презентацию, мы очень ему благодарны. Маурисио, пожалуйста, слово вам. Мы вам поможем показать презентацию.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you, colleagues, so much. Good morning from Colombia. Good afternoon to you. I want to continue some of the topics that other colleagues have started. In the next slide, I want to provide a brief overview of what I will be talking about. There are three main messages that I want to send to you colleagues. The first one is related to practical aspects of SDG budget tagging that we did in Colombia. The second one is related to the challenges that currently the exercise faces. And the third one is a group of lessons learned from the experience of the budget tagging that was done in Colombia. Specifically, and just in case we lose some people or some connection, the practical aspects of the SDG budget tagging methodology that I will present and that some of you are familiar with is related to how we did this exercise jointly with the government, specifically the SDG budget tagging with the government and the two institutions that participated in the budget tagging were the Ministry of Finance as well as the National Planning Department. This methodology included using multiple targets for each government expenditure, and there are also some benefits that was related to the treatment of operational expenses, which is an interesting topic that we will get to more details in a few slides. For the moment, I want to mention some key challenges. Some of the challenges that we have seen in Colombia, at least, after doing the budget tagging, is that the budget tagging is a top-down methodology. SDG budget tagging was done from the Ministry of Finance or with collaboration of with the National Planning Department, and obviously in collaboration with UNDP and the agencies involved within the INFF. And the budget tagging is thus a methodology, a top-down methodology. It's assigned or it's managed by the Ministry of Finance and the Planning Department in Colombia. And this is different from other budget tagging initiatives that have been implemented in Colombia. Specifically, Colombia has implemented 4 and it's working on a 5th thematic or budget tagging for a particular topic. So we have 4 or 5 of those. And in this case, or in these 4 or 5 cases, the methodology is a bottom-up reporting situation where the line ministries are the ones reporting the information to the Ministry of Finance. In this regard, we have seen also that there are some other challenges on how to integrate SDG budget tagging with existing green taxonomies, as well as green frameworks that the government has recently implemented. Colombia in the past year has implemented its green bond initiative, and it has also recently come up with a green taxonomy. And so one of the key challenges is to learn how to create synergies between SDG budget tagging and existing green frameworks or green taxonomies. And another key challenge that we have seen is how we can use this SDG budget tagging methodology to look at the private sector. Because sustainable development is not only part of public aspects, but rather a whole of society approach. And thus the private sector needs to be heavily involved in SDG and sustainable development. And some of the lessons that we have learned so far are that there is more precision, more accurate information once you move from tagging projects to doing an SDG tagging of deliverables within the project. I'll show you some of that at the end of the presentation. And another very interesting lesson learned that sounds simple, but it's actually very powerful, is that in teaching details about SDGs to government officials actually helps and contributes to any discussion around budget tagging with government officials. Usually from the UN side, we assume that all officials, government officials, know about SDGs and their 169 targets, as well as the 231 indicators. But what we realize is that that is not always the case. And the more all actors and all government officials within the Ministry of Finance know about the 169 targets and the 231 indicators, the easier it will be for the country to do a budget tagging. In the next slide, I just want to give provide an overall context for what INFF Colombia is doing. We have two outcomes. The first one of which is the mapping of the current SDG financial architecture. And the idea is to take a picture of what's happening right now in terms of how SDGs are being financed. And the second one is how is the design of an SDG financing strategy, which is what we are going to be in Colombia focusing on in 2022. We always look at SDG financing from three pillars to make it easier for everybody: public sector, private sector, and development cooperation funding. These are the three pillars that we usually use to think about SDG financing. Obviously, there are cases where SDG financing between those three pillars will have mixed ways to implement within a country or to operate within a country. But we usually like to look at those separate pillars, although they are interconnected. In the next slide, I want to show you the results of the SDG budget tagging that we did in Colombia. And the main result that we found while doing this SDG budget tagging is that 89% of the national budget is aligned with SDGs. So what we did was we took the government budget for 2020, and then we did it later for or more recently for 2022, and we used a budget tagging at the project level for the 169 targets. Here you will see a more condensed version where we present 17 SDGs. And what we did was we looked at the yellow parts, which are the investment lines, as well as the blue lines, which are the ones the expenses related to operational expenses, and thus those are the main categories that we had within the operating expenses. and that's why we have different scales of the blue color. We have the intergovernmental transfers, as well as the expenses that were particularly related to the mitigation of COVID-19 and the emergency that happened in 2020. In the next slide, I'll give you a little bit of some of the results that we had while implementing the same methodology for the development cooperation that Colombia receives. There is an agency within Colombia that has the task of monitoring the development cooperation that arrives to the country, and they were interested in looking at SDG support or SDG financing using the same methodology that the Ministry of Finance did. So this is the result that we did with them. In the next slide, I'll show you a brief overview of what we can do once the SDG budget tagging occurs, since SDGs cover a great amount of topics that are related to sustainable development. Once you have that umbrella ready, you can actually filter different particular indicators or topics within the SDG budget tagging. Here are two examples, given that we have also in the INFF, we have a participation from UNICEF as well as UN Women. And once we took that SDG budget tagging and we did the filter for one particular topic, well, in this case, two particular topics, yeah, you can see that there is a chance to actually have a more detailed overview of what's happening once you get interested into a topic. And this will be very important because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are 4 and possibly this year 5 different budget tagging exercises being done in Colombia. One is for victims of conflict, one is for Afro communities, there is another one for indigenous communities, and so there is another one for gender, which is the more solid version of the budget tagging, and there is now one that the government wants to implement, or some part of the government want to implement for the particular topic of childhood. Going to the next slide, I'll give you some detail of how the SDG budget tagging was done in Colombia. The first step that we did to implement the SDG budget tagging was a setup of all the databases that we have. This included having budgetary information at the level of projects, not programs. Then the step that we took was to choose the cycle within the budget cycle, a stage within the budget cycle. And then we had the 169 SDG global targets. And we also used, this is not, I don't think this is very common internationally, but we had the product catalog for each investment project. What that means is that for each project that the government creates, the government has a catalog or a menu of deliverables that it attaches to investment projects. So that's going to be very important, because once we look at with the government budget lines, we were not really sure whether that particular project was aiming at 3 or 4 or 5 SDG targets, right? But once you look at deliverables within the budget line, you can actually understand what the project is trying to aim at, and that was very useful information that we are trying to use nowadays to make the exercise, the SDG budget tagging exercise, more precise. On the second step, we defined some rules and did what we call the manual alignment on a topic level or thematic alignment. We didn't involve money or resources at this point. So the second step is to look at a project and without looking at the money or resources, focus on what the aim of the project is, right? So in that regard, we chose a principal SDG target out of the 169 targets and up to 5 secondary SDG targets. This is optional. The government had the chance to choose between one secondary target and up to 5. Whether the government wants to do 2 or 3, it's up to basically the project, right? Looking at the specific details of the project. Once you do that, you can actually select topics and determine which topics are really not being aligned to SDG topics, right? That is very important because there are actually actions within the government that are not aligned with SDG targets. We have a list, a more extensive list of what Colombia did not consider as contributing to SDGs. Some examples of that, but we have a longer document, a detailed document with a comprehensive list of what we did not consider supporting SDGs. Include some examples such as fines or fines that the government has to pay on an international level, or some security schemes for government officials. For instance, armored vehicles or security personnel being provided, for instance, to ministries or ministers themselves. On the third step that we did was the actual resource alignment or the budget alignment. And what we did was select a percentages for the main target and the complementary targets or the secondary targets. And the way we did that, we started with a 75% allocation for the main target and dividing the other 25% for all in equal amounts for the complementary targets. That's how we did it. And so at the end of the day, what ended up happening was that the government decided to do a little bit different, and for each sector, and in Colombia we have COFOG classification, but the government has 30 sectors, and for each sector the government decided to establish different percentages. So for instance, in some cases the government said, yes, we like the 75, the 25% rule, but in other cases, we like other percentages. For instance, perhaps 60%, and then the remaining 40% to be split or divided for the secondary targets. On the fourth step, what we did was use that information. Since we first approached investment lines, we then moved to looking at operating expenses. Some of the operating expenses behave as investment lines, and so we treated them manually. But more generally, there were some other operating expenses that behaved very much like operating expenses do, like salaries. And so in those cases, what we did was for each entity, each office or ministry within the government, we tabulated the 169 SDG targets. And once we did the tabulation, we did the extrapolation of that distribution to operating expenses. The idea behind, or the support behind doing that extrapolation, is that operating expenses will always go hand in hand with investment expenses, right? There is no investment expense that is not accompanied, that does not come along with operating expense, right? So, for instance, if there is an investment project for in a rural area, that will only be achieved if there is salaries of government officials involved, right? If there is the payment of public services such as water, electricity. So those projects, investment projects, work when there is support from operating expenses. And that's the argument that we use to extrapolate the behavior of SDG targets in operating expenses. And we took that distribution, and then we put the distribution on the operating expenses. That's the fourth step here. And the final one was basically a consolidation and final validation with stakeholders. That's what we did. In the next slide, please. There is here are some innovations that we have for the methodology. As I mentioned, it's a multidimensional, so we include multiple SDG targets, and given the synergies between them, we went not only at the 17 goal level, but rather at the 169 target level. We look at operational expenses. Once you implement this, you can use SDG body tagging, or you can consolidate using COFOG classifications or any local sector classification. And as the budget cycle moves on, or the fiscal year runs its course, there is actually the chance to look at either commitments or actual expenditures. So that's once you have the Excel file, to call it that way, ready for with your SDG budget tagging, you can actually look at any step within the budget cycle. And obviously, since the Excel file is labeled with the SDG targets, you can actually use the same tagging for other fiscal years, because there is, within the FMIS, or the Financial Management Information System, the codes will be the same for most of the projects from one year to another, so you can extrapolate for other years. As I mentioned, we did this also for Incoming Development Cooperation, but this can also be applied to regional budgets, not only national. We're actually doing it with the royalties that come out of gas and oil exploration. The royalties that come from that goes and is distributed to the regions, and we're actually doing the SDG alignment of that particular national source of resources. Also, we are implementing this kind of analysis, budget tagging, for multilateral loans, to make sure and to understand what is the benefit from having SDG labeled bonds or sustainability linked bonds, as opposed to regular debt, if you can call it that way. In the next slide, I'll give you an overview of what we did. We did the SDG budget tagging for 30 sectors. That meant 194 institutions. And specifically for 1 year, there were 3,000 budget lines that were manually matched with SDG targets. There were about 1,500 investment projects, as well as 1,500 operational expenses. Those are the big numbers that we did. And specifically, the way we did this, and this is just a particular example. We took institution A within sector B, and we looked at an investment project that was, for instance, $100 million. And what we did was we chose one main SDG target, in this case, looking at the objective of the project and the budget line. We linked it to SDG target 17.1 8.14 as the main target. And we also chose two other additional SDG targets, which were in this case 9.1 as well as 8.3. And as I mentioned, we put 75% of the resources into the main target, and then we split the remaining part into the secondary targets. This is the main example. As I mentioned, depending on the sector, it will not be always 75%, but rather 60, and it depends. In the next slide, I want to show you how we treated operational expenses. On the left-hand side, you will see investment expenses and how they were distributed for one particular institution towards SDG targets. You can see, for instance, there is 38% for SDG target 16.6, and as well as the other, the rest of the distribution. So what we did was we took the distribution, and then we, at the entity level, or the each ministry, we used that distribution for investment lines, and we did the imputation or the extrapolation towards operational expenses. So we took, for instance, salaries, but we did the same distribution because, as I mentioned, there is no investment project that can go by itself or be implemented by itself. There has to be some operational expenses behind it, and that's the innovation that we thought it was very interesting. In the next slide, I'll give you an overview of the how those rules, 75 to 25%, were adjusted or chosen by the government. If we go to the next slide, please, you will see how those distribution rules ended up being practiced. In some cases, the 75% was maintained. That's for agriculture, environment, defense, education, technology and transportation, as well as the trade sector, interior, as well as the office of the president. However, there was some changes within the secondary targets, how much percentage those secondary targets were going to obtain. And there was, for instance, some sectors such as Congress, Foreign Affairs, and Healthcare, that decided to, the Ministry of Finance decided, and the National Planning Department decided to assign 60% of resources in the SDG Body Tag to the main target, and 15% for the secondary, first secondary, 10%, and sort of a scaled percentage distribution for these particular SDG targets. If we go to the next slide, I want to move over to more of the challenges that we see within the budget tagging. The first topic that I want to mention is that the governance of budget tagging, it's actually very interesting. As I mentioned, Colombia has 4 budget tagging that are that have already some institutional history and that are already in operation. In those cases, in all cases, the reporting information is sent by the ministries to the Ministry of Finance and the National Planning Department. So that's why I like to call them a bottom-up exercise. The ministries have the information, and the Ministry of Finance has a system where ministries report how many resources are going for gender, for victims of conflict, for Afro communities, for indigenous communities, and so that is a report that is presented actually to Congress on an annual basis, and the most relevant budget tracker for the country has been the one for gender, which actually has, as I mentioned, an annual report to Congress. there are some challenges in those approaches. And as I mentioned, those are approaches that we call bottom-up. And in those situations, the quality of information will vary or will change depending on the ministry that generates the information. So that is something that needs to be taken into account if there is going to be another exercise of that particular kind of, or if there is any interest at the beginning towards one particular topic, right? Because not all ministries will have the same capacity to report for one topic. So you will see a variation between ministries, between the quality of information between ministries, and also the quality of information that is sent to the Ministry of Finance will depend on the person that is chosen for the exercise within one ministry. On the other hand, the top-down approach, which is the SDG body tagging done by the Ministry of Finance, requires that the Ministry of Finance has knowledge about the 169 SDG targets. As I mentioned, that's why it is very important for UNDP and the Ministry of Finance to collaborate to make sure that Ministry of Finance officials know about the 169 targets as well as the 231 indicators. The fourth topic that I have here on the first box is related to how civil society or the general public are empowered, and this is a good thing in regards to sustainable development. Once there is a budget tracking exercise for one topic, civil society or general public will be very interested in the money or the resources that are being allocated on an annual basis to that particular topic. And sometimes what happens is that those groups are very vocal, and to some extent they should be, and they like to say, okay, this is my amount of resources, and I want to make sure that is going to be my particular amount for next year, right? But sometimes with the Ministry of Finance, that's not how things work, given that there has to be some cushion or a flexibility between if a particular sector has $100, to put an example, $100 for 1 year, it is very possible that for budgetary restrictions or inflexibility or multiple reasons, perhaps the next year, not only the $100 will not be able to be allocated to a particular sector, but perhaps 90% of that amount, or $90. So those are things that need to be taken into consideration. Once a country, and those are the challenges that we have seen in Colombia, once Colombia embarked or was able to do one SDG budget tagging for one topic, and for one particular topic in 2011, multiple sectors have requested their own topic or their own budget trackers. So that's something that needs to be taken into account, because once you go from one budget tracker to two budget trackers to three, it becomes a little bit complicated for the Ministry of Finance to handle all of them. So that's why we're trying to move on towards a more SDG umbrella approach where all topics can be covered. And that's why it's preferred to one topic. And another thing that needs to be taken into account is that SDG body tagging allows to take a picture of SDG financing, but that does not mean that you will close gaps, right? It is the initial step, but it doesn't mean that automatically the country will start an acceleration process towards the closing of development gaps. Some other challenges that we have seen in the multiple sectors are that society overall has multiple sustainability frameworks that do not speak SDG language, are related to SDG, but are not directly does not have a one-to-one equivalent to SDG topics. Also, within the private sector, there is mostly a one-way materiality, which that means is companies report on the effect that the context is having on the company. Those are the main the spirit of the sustainability frameworks, but those frameworks do not always take into account how the company affects the environment. Right? That is something that, at least in Europe, is being looked at, and they are taking great steps in that regard. But there is also some room to promote a single language or SDG language instead of talking about different topics, right? And one last challenge that I want to mention is that once there is a budget tagging or an SDG budget tagging in particular, and we did this, we are trying to see how the SDG budget tagging will operate or create synergies with the green taxonomies that Colombia has, that recently launched. There are very detailed green taxonomy procedures that Colombia has established. And so we're trying to see how those green taxonomies could have more synergies with the SDG budget tag. In the next slide, I want to move on to lessons learned. The first one is that budgets in SDG language facilitate communication with the public. As I mentioned, the budget from the Ministry of Finance side is very technical, and once you put an SDG language within the budget, which is the budget tagging, you create a bridge with the public, and there is more understanding from the public side on what the government is doing. That is very, very beneficial for both sides. The government wants to communicate its information. The public wants to know what the government is doing, right? So instead of having a very technical language that is the budget, having the budget in tagged or labeled with SDGs creates that bridge of communication with the public. What we have learned recently is that tagging or labeling up to 3 SDG targets can be more strategic instead of 5. So we are trying to move on towards that side. And we have moved on, and this is the third box that I have right here. We have moved on from towards a more detailed label or tagging of the budget, where we looked at not only at the project level, but rather at the deliverable level of each project. And if we move to the next slide, you will see the difference. There is not much difference between tagging at the project level, as well as tagging deliverables or products within the project. There is more precision. So here the invitation is for other countries to do a tagging at the project level. But if there is willingness to do a more precise tagging, it can happen at the level of deliverables. So with that, I will conclude my presentation. As I mentioned, Colombia has green taxonomies and has implemented green bonds. Also, Colombia has done recently the SDG body tagging. We are still trying to see ways in which we can do this in a more automatic way instead of doing it so manual. And that is why we're trying to move on to a SDG labeling or tagging of projects deliverables. So thank you so much, colleagues, and happy to answer all your questions.
Спасибо, Маурисио, за очень интересную и содержательную презентацию. Очень было интересно участникам узнать по колумбийскому опыту, да, насколько вот, как и говорил Сурен в начале своей презентации, что чем дальше мы идем, чем глубже мы делаем маркировку на уровне задач, тем сложнее, да, и тем больше требуется аналитическая работа и аналитическая как бы поддержка, да. Позвольте, я попрошу коллег задать вопрос. Пожалуйста, коллеги, если у кого есть вопросы, можете задать. Я думаю, очень много сегодня насыщенная у нас была программа, много было, очень много информации. Есть вопрос, коллеги? Если позволите, я вот буквально пока коллеги думают насчет вопроса Маурисио, вам в чате был вопрос один, наша коллега Зарина Сараджидинова, она вот просила все-таки уточнить, есть ли опыт каких-то стран, где маркировка бюджета под СУР или же климатическая маркировка делалась на уровне местных бюджетов, на уровне каких-то отдельных регионов, региональных бюджетов? Если можно, кто может ответить?
Yes, there are some cases, and the government of Colombia has done.
Да, пожалуйста, Маурисио.
Oh, sorry. As I was mentioning, there are some cases where in Colombia, where the local governments have done SDG tagging, but and this is the case of the national government itself. 4 years ago, they did a label, a thematic label, not a budget label, but a thematic. So there are actually some cities and regions within Colombia that have done a thematic alignment. That is only to see which topics the city development plan or the state development plan is aligned toward SDG topics, but they have not done it so far in terms of resources. So that's what we're trying to help them with.
Спасибо большое, Маурисио. По-моему, Сурен тоже хочет добавить что-то. Пожалуйста, Сурен.
Да, быстренько просто добавлю, что лично я не знаю случая, когда вот такая маркировка, например, климатическая, происходила бы только на уровне субнациональном, на муниципальном или областном. Но есть несколько стран, когда вот где такая маркировка происходила параллельно и на национальном, и на субнациональном уровне. Например, у нас в ПРООН есть отчет про бюджетирование, по климатическое бюджетирование и маркировку. Глобальный такой анализ был. И, например, в Гане на уровне и национальном, и муниципальном. Во Франции на национальном и на уровне местных самоуправлений. В Индонезии после того, как на национальном уровне это происходило, после этого также и перевели вот эту работу на уровень субнационального. Ну, там Индонезия большая страна, там субнациональный, это огромные отдельные страны, можно сказать. Есть еще в Кении такой опыт, есть такой опыт в Пакистане и в Филиппинах. Вот то, что вот у меня перед собой на экране есть, согласно отчету ПРООН. Но, как я уже сказал, отдельно вот муниципального уровня, областного уровня маркировки я лично не знаю. Спасибо.
Спасибо огромное, коллеги. Дело в том, что этот вопрос очень интересен для нас, поскольку вот, Сурен, я вам написала, да, что у нас есть отдельные регионы, это вот в частности зоны экологической катастрофы и другие территории, которые остро нуждаются в большем объеме финансирования по сравнению с другими регионами. Именно поэтому у меня и возник этот вопрос. Спасибо огромное.
Спасибо большое. У вас тоже вопрос? Да, пожалуйста, пожалуйста.
Маурисио, спасибо за презентацию. По поводу пятиэтапной методологии, которую в Колумбии используют, вопрос по вот этой методологии. Мы обратили все внимание, что там очень много ручного вмешательства. То есть почти что на каждом из этапов идет ручное тематическое согласование, либо согласование вот этих расходов, вот этого всего процесса бюджетного. Вопрос. В самом начале вот этой реформы вашей, перехода на маркировку по ЦУР, сколько времени занимал этот процесс? Итого. И сейчас на протяжении определенного времени, есть ли какая-то динамика именно по времени согласования и в ручном согласовании? То есть здесь ключевая фраза «ручной». Спасибо.
Okay, thank you so much for the question. That is a very important logistical matter. In Colombia, the SDG body tag that we did, which was line by line, took around 2 months with 4 people. The idea of doing it with 4 people that were in charge of this was to make sure that there was no, or that there was a reduced human error when tagging each project, right? So instead of having one person doing it and then having a review, we did like 4 people looking at it jointly every single day for about 4 hours for about 2 months. And once that was the case and that was concluded, looking at each line, there was a period of about 1 month where that group of people were presenting or validating the exercise with Ministry of Finance officials and National Planning Department. So it was basically multi-agency validation for around 1 month. So I would say between 3 to 4 months it would take to do the SDG body tagging.